Hey everyone, let's start by looking at why people even needed the idea of a witch. Think about it. Throughout history, whenever something awful and confusing happened, like a strong kid suddenly getting sick, or the whole harvest failing, people had to find a specific reason. They didn't just want to hear bad luck. The belief in magic, and eventually in the witch, was the oldest, scariest answer to the big question, why me? We've seen this concept everywhere. Even way back in ancient times, like in Mesopotamia, the rules said you'd be executed for practicing kisbu, their word for black magic. And in the Roman Empire, people were sentenced to death for beneficium, poisoning and dark magic. So the witch was always there, explaining bad events. But the real, terrifying craze didn't start with ancient laws. It began when the church and society completely changed how they classified everything. The codification of malevolence. For the longest time, magic wasn't totally good or totally bad, it had gray areas. You had the genuinely bad stuff, maleficium, but you also had the helpful magic from the cunning folk. These folks were like local experts, selling charms and healing stuff. Generally, they were okay. However, in early modern Europe, everything changed dramatically. All those gray areas were just wiped out. The fear went through the roof, mostly because the church and the government got serious. They published and spread this awful instruction book called the Malleus Maleficarum, which means the Hammer of the Witches. This wasn't just a guide, it was a rule book for terror. It said a witch wasn't just doing harmful spells, they were a heretic. They had signed an explicit pact with the devil, the absolute worst crime imaginable. The mechanism of conjuration. The Malleus even laid out exactly how to find and prosecute this evil magic, maleficium. They believed witches used imitative magic. What does that mean? Well, if a witch wanted to hurt you, they'd grab something that belonged to you, a bit of hair or a piece of clothing, and use it to make a little wax doll, a puppet. Then, whatever they did to that doll, burning it, sticking it with pins, they believed it would instantly transfer that pain to your real body. Judges also looked for a familiar. This was supposedly a small demon pet, like a cat, rat, or toad, that helped the witch. Sometimes they even looked for a witch's mark, a spot where the familiar supposedly fed. So, when anything bad happened, a sick cow, a child with fever, the accusation was instantly made. It always targeted someone on the outs, someone easy to point to, making them the perfect scapegoat. And once that finger was pointed, there was no stopping the terrible, cruel machine of the Great Terror. Wow, what a nightmare! In the dark corners of 17th century Bamberg, where the witch was a tool of the devil, bound by a terrible oath. But that image, the hag on a broomstick, kissing the goat, that is merely the latest mask worn by an ancient spirit of fear. To truly understand this history, we have to travel further back, to a time before the devil was named, before Christ was born, to the very dawn of written language. We need to find the first whispered word for the person who could harm you with a thought. The Anglo-Saxon roots. In the dusty manuscripts of Anglo-Saxon England, the word we use today was taking shape. It wasn't about a specific gender or a grand conspiracy, it was a craft. They called it witchcraft, the craft of the wiki. And what did the wiki do? They twisted things. They used their knowledge to make things turn the wrong way, to spoil the grain, to sour the milk, to lead travelers off the path. It was a local, earthy form of malice. Look further north, across the cold, dark fjords of Norway and Sweden. The Vikings spoke of the hagtess, which gives us our word hag and, perhaps, the root of hex. The hagtess was usually a woman, powerful and feared, who could summon storms, travel in animal form, and wield the terrible power of the Seeder, a deep, complex, and often dangerous type of Norse magic. This was magic that didn't just hurt you, it twisted your fate itself. Even here, in the oldest words of the ancient earth, the core concept remains the same: a person with the ability to inflict supernatural harm. The birth of law in Mesopotamia. Now, let's go back 4,000 years, to the baked clay city-states of Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Here, around 1754 BCE, the great king Hammurabi laid down his laws. And among the first offenses detailed was the crime of witchcraft. In his famous code, Hammurabi decreed a terrifying trial by water for the accused. If you were accused of practicing kisbu, Mesopotamian black magic, you were literally thrown into the Euphrates River. If the river god accepted you, you sank and drowned. Your accuser would then claim your house. But if the river god rejected you, if you survived and managed to crawl to shore, the accuser was put to death. Think of the severity. This was not a matter of superstition, it was a matter of state law, treated with the same gravity as murder or theft. The fear of kisbu was so potent it drove the foundation of their legal system. The Roman poisoners. Fast forward to the vibrant, chaotic streets of Rome. Here, the fear of magic fused violently with the fear of poison. The Roman crime was called veneficium, and its very name tells the story. Veneficium meant both the act of poisoning and the practice of magic. The Romans understood that the boundary between a deadly potion and a magical charm was paper thin. A root that could cure could also kill. The local sores, sorcerer, or saga, wise woman, or soothsayer, was both feared and consulted. But when Rome descended into political chaos and plague, the fear of veneficium exploded. During the Republic and early Empire, thousands were executed for this crime. They weren't necessarily making pacts with demons, they were using spells and poisons to manipulate elections, steal inheritances, or gain the affections of a wealthy citizen. The Roman witch was a powerful, often aristocratic, manipulator using hidden arts to subvert the rigid social order. In these three ancient civilizations, the Saxon, the Mesopotamian, and the Roman, the common thread is the profound, societal fear of invisible, personal malice. They didn't fear the devil, they feared the bitter neighbor, the greedy rival, the subtle power that lay in the hands of the cunning and the marginalized. This ancient, localized fear of maleficium would eventually collide with a new, monolithic power, the Church. And when those two forces met, the terror would become absolute. If you are a farmer in ancient Rome or a villager in Anglo-Saxon England, your fear is local, a personal curse, a neighbor's poison. But for the Great Terror to truly take hold of Europe, that fear had to become systemic. The church and the state needed to convince the people that the threat wasn't just a bitter old woman, it was an organized, secret army dedicated to the destruction of all Christian society. This is the chapter where we introduce the most fantastic, terrifying, and utterly fictional gathering in all of European history, the Witches' Sabbath. The birth of the conspiracy. For centuries, the church denied the reality of witches. They believed the idea of flying at night or transforming into animals was mere fantasy, a delusion put forth by the devil. But by the 14th and 15th centuries, a dangerous new narrative began to emerge, merging the ancient fear of magic with the new theological fear of heresy. The question became, if witches are enemies of God, how do they meet? The answer, fabricated through torture and scholarly paranoia, was the Sabbath, or Sabbat. The Sabbath was not a party, it was an anti-church. It was the complete, theatrical inversion of every moral, social, and spiritual norm. It was believed to occur on specific nights, Walpurgis Night, Halloween, or the eve of certain Christian feast days, and it was almost always held in a wild, remote place, a dark forest clearing, a hilltop like the Brocken in Germany, or a desolate field. The journey and the rituals. Imagine the terror of the accused, often an old woman or a midwife, whispering her forced confession in a cold courtroom. They claimed the witch prepared for the journey by rubbing a special flying ointment, a hallucinogenic mixture of herbs and fats, onto their bodies or onto a staff. Then, they would fly. Not through the clouds, but sometimes through the chimney smoke, or merely by being transported instantly by the devil himself. The confession of the accused gave us the spectacle. Upon arrival, the central ceremony was the homage to the devil. The devil would appear, often as a black goat, a massive toad, or a handsome, stern man in black, and the witch would formally renounce Christ, trample on the cross, and offer themselves entirely to his service. This act culminated in the infamous osculum in fame, the shameful kiss, where the witch was forced to kiss the devil's posterior, an ultimate symbol of degradation and submission. The Feast of Transgression. The night then dissolved into a frenzy of imagined transgression. The confessions claimed the witches held a grotesque feast where all the holy rules were broken. They ate cannibalistic feasts, sometimes dining on the flesh of unbaptized infants they were accused of having murdered. They drank horrible, thick liquids from unholy cups. They engaged in promiscuous and perverse sexual acts, a complete rejection of Christian marriage and chastity. The whole gathering was a festival of total anarchy, violence, and forbidden pleasure, confirming the absolute moral corruption of those present. The purpose of this entire, demonic spectacle was twofold. 1. To receive assignments. The devil would give out the yearly work, who to curse, what storms to raise, which cattle to strike dead. 2. To initiate new members. Fresh converts were brought in, solidifying the idea that this was a growing, structured organization, a threat that was multiplying and spreading into every town and village. The power of belief. The most important truth about the witches' Sabbath is that it was never real. It was a narrative fiction created by inquisitors and judges, extracted under relentless pressure and torture. Yet, its invention was a masterpiece of social control. By transforming individual acts of maleficium into a vast, organized, and diabolical conspiracy, the authorities managed to turn the fear of the neighbor into the fear of the enemy within, a force so vast and so evil that only the combined power of the church and the state could possibly hope to defeat it. This dark, cohesive narrative was the final ingredient needed to ignite the fuse of the great European witch hunt. The village was afraid of the witch, but the church, for a long time, was merely skeptical. They believed in God's power, and that God wouldn't allow a mere mortal to command storms or steal crops. They saw flying to a Sabbath as a delusion planted by the devil, not a physical reality. But as the Middle Ages gave way to the early modern period, the fear of the devil began to eclipse even the fear of God. The witch was no longer a person who stole butter, she was a person who denied Christ. This shift transformed the trial from a criminal matter into a matter of heresy, and heresy warranted the purifying power of fire. The scriptural mandate. To justify this new, violent persecution, the accusers looked back to the ultimate spiritual authority, Scripture. They found their justification in the Old Testament, most famously in the book of Exodus, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." This command, they argued, was a clear, divine mandate for execution. Across the Abrahamic faiths, the relationship with magic was complex. Judaism, Jewish tradition acknowledged the reality of certain forms of magic and even had categories for beneficial, white magic, segulet, like charms or mystical healing. However, idolatrous magic and sorcery, especially those involving the spirits of the dead, were strictly forbidden. The ultimate crime was not the magic itself, but the turning away from God it implied. Islam, In the Islamic world, the existence of seer, magic or sorcery, is not disputed, and there are stories of prophets dealing with magicians. Like the other faiths, the core issue is the source of the power. If the power came from jinn or demons, and if it was used to cause harm, it was a severe sin and a crime punishable by death. Islamic courts dealt with these accusations, but generally avoided the widespread, panicked mass hunts seen in Europe. The Christian turning point, the Devil's Pact. It was within Christianity that the concept of the witch reached its most dangerous form. This was the theological leap that fueled the flames. The Church decided that for a witch to have any magical power at all, no matter how small, they must have derived it directly from the most powerful opponent of God, Satan. This is the diabolical pact. It wasn't about a simple, one-off curse, it was a treasonous, spiritual contract. The witch traded her soul for temporary, worldly power, the power to spoil a harvest, cause an accident, or raise a storm. Suddenly, the witch was not just committing a crime against her neighbor, she was committing high treason against the kingdom of heaven. The Inquisitor's new weapon. This idea was weaponized by the Inquisitors, whose duty was to root out heresy. They argued that because the witch had entered into a pact, the crime wasn't just maleficium, but apostasy, the abandonment of one's faith. This justification made the hunts legal, spiritual, and moral. It gave the Inquisitors the right to use torture to extract the truth about the devil's influence, since the crime was spiritual treason of the highest order. By the 16th century, the witch was the ultimate symbol of the forces trying to tear Christian society apart. The hunt for the witch became a holy mission, a divine duty to purify the soul of Europe. The local fear was now consecrated by the highest authority, turning a neighborhood feud into a cosmic war for salvation. And this sacred justification is what led directly to the explosion of violence we call the Great Terror. We have traced the journey of the witch, from a local troublemaker to a servant of Satan. With the theological justification complete, all barriers, legal, moral, and spiritual, were dropped. What followed was a disaster of human cruelty that swept across Europe for nearly 2 centuries. This was the Great Terror. The scale of the calamity. From roughly 1450 to 1750, Europe was gripped by what historians call the witch craze. We will never know the exact number, but estimates suggest that over 100,000 people were formally prosecuted for witchcraft across the continent, with between 40,000 and 60,000 executions. In some regions, the persecution was mild. But in others, like the Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg, Trier, or the territory of Scotland, the hunts were absolute purges, annihilating entire communities. For example, during the 16th and 17th centuries, Scotland, a sparsely populated nation, saw a prosecution rate much higher than the European average, with thousands facing trial. Who was the accused? Contrary to popular myth, the witch was not always a woman, but they were overwhelmingly the victims. Roughly 80% of those executed were women. Why? Historians point to a pervasive societal current of misogyny. Women, especially those outside the rigid patriarchal structure, the widows, the single mothers, the independent healers, were often viewed as weaker in faith, more susceptible to the devil's temptation, and inherently driven by lust and malice. The typical victim was a poor, older woman on the margins of society, often known as a folk healer or midwife. But once the panic took hold, the accusations widened, hitting neighbors, men, and even small children. The mechanism of terror, the 4 pillars of accusation. How did a private grudge become a death sentence? There were 4 common paths to the pyre. 1. Envy and conflict. The neighbor's grudge, the most common path. You argued with your neighbor, maybe over a fence or a debt. You walked away saying, "I hope your cow drops dead." A week later, the cow does drop dead. That correlation becomes the core of the accusation. 2. The failed healer. The cunning folk, the wise women who healed with herbs, were tolerated until they failed. If their cure didn't work, they were instantly suspected of using their power to harm instead of help. 3. The witch's mark. The inquisitors looked for any physical abnormality, a mole, a scar, a birthmark, that could be interpreted as the spot where the devil's familiar sucked blood. The search for these witches' marks was invasive and humiliating. The chain reaction. One confession under torture would instantly trigger a dozen new accusations. The terror would spread like a viral infection. The accused, desperate for relief, would name their enemies, their rivals, or simply the first names that came to mind. This is how entire villages could be swept into a frenzy, with hundreds executed in a single year, as seen in the German territories. From this harrowing period, we learn a crucial lesson. Witchcraft prosecutions were not a legal process to find truth, they were a social mechanism to displace fear, settle scores, and consolidate the political and religious authority of the time. The victim was crushed between the millstones of ancient superstition and absolute theological paranoia. The fires of the Great Terror in Europe eventually began to die down in the late 17th century, largely due to Enlightenment philosophy and a growing skepticism from the educated elite about spectral evidence and torture-induced confessions. But just as the old world was tiring of the hunt, the fear took root in the small, rigid communities of the New World. The witch hunt crossed the ocean, but it changed its character. It became wrapped up in the complex politics of race, religion, and the brutal collision of cultures known as colonialism. The moment of madness, Salem. In North America, the name Salem stands alone. In the bitter winter of 1692, in a Massachusetts village deeply rooted in Puritan piety and fear of the wilderness, the terror exploded. It began, infamously, with a group of young girls, led by the slave woman Tituba, experimenting with fortune-telling and stories of the occult. When the girls began to suffer fits, convulsions, and hallucinations, the local doctor diagnosed the cause: witchcraft. The Salem trials were unique in their intensity, if not their scale. While Europe executed thousands, Salem executed 19 people by hanging, and one man was pressed to death. But the horror of Salem lies not in the numbers, but in the use of spectral evidence, the idea that the spirit, or specter, of the accused could torment the victim, even if the person was physically elsewhere. This type of evidence was impossible to defend against, and it allowed the young accusers immense, terrifying power. Salem was a brief, brutal outbreak that ended almost as quickly as it began, leaving an indelible scar on the American legal and psychological landscape. The melting pot of magic, Latin America. Far south of the Puritan villages, in the vast colonial empires of Spain and Portugal, the story of witchcraft took an even more complex turn. When European judges arrived, they found a spiritual landscape utterly different from their own, a syncretic blend of three distinct magical traditions. 1. Spanish Catholicism, bringing the European devil's pact theology. 2. Indigenous beliefs, native spiritual practices, often focusing on nature spirits, ancestral magic, and folk healers. 3. African traditions, spiritual practices brought by enslaved people, roots of what would become Santeria, Vodou, and Candomblé, practices rich with healing, divination, and powerful deities. This collision created brujeria, the Spanish word for witchcraft. The European inquisitors were often less concerned with the devil's pact, and more concerned with social control and race. In Mexico City or Lima, the accused witch was often a mestiza, mixed-race woman, or an indigenous healer. The crime wasn't just heresy, It was the practice of a powerful, uncontrollable form of magic that existed outside the authority of the church and the white colonial ruling class. The fear of magic became inseparable from the fear of rebellion and the fear of the other. The shifting shadow. The American story of witchcraft demonstrates how fear is portable. It shows that when two cultures meet, the most powerful and terrifying narrative often wins. In the Americas, the concept of the witch evolved from the devil's pawn to a figure of racial and cultural power and resistance. It revealed that wherever a society feels stress, whether it's the cold isolation of Puritan New England or the immense cultural pressure of a colonial empire, the easy answer to misfortune will always be the same: to point a finger at the person on the outside, the person who looks or believes differently. When we look at the history of the European witch, we are looking at a closed chapter, a period of history defined by the Devil's Pact that ended with the rise of the Enlightenment. But in many parts of the world, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, the belief in witches is not history, it is an active, daily reality. The African concept of the witch, however, is fundamentally different from the European one, and this difference is crucial to understanding its enduring power. A different kind of power, internal versus external. In traditional European theology, the witch chose to make a pact with the devil. It was a conscious, treasonous decision. In many African cosmologies, the witch does not necessarily choose their power. Instead, the ability to do harm comes from an internal, inherent substance or spirit, often called jam or similar terms, depending on the culture. The witch is someone who possesses this antisocial force and uses it unconsciously or compulsively, often while sleeping, to eat the life force or luck of others. The power, it's not about external pacts, it's about internal, inherited malice. The crime is not heresy against God, but antisocial behavior, using one's inherent spiritual power to harm one's own community, often one's own family. The motivation isn't a satanic contract, but often envy, jealousy, or bitterness that manifests as destructive power. Witchcraft and modernity. Colonialism introduced Christian and Islamic faiths, but it did not eliminate the belief in indigenous witchcraft. Instead, it often made it more intense. As modernization, urbanization, and poverty increased, traditional social structures began to fray. In a community facing immense, inexplicable hardship, like AIDS, crop failure, or sudden economic collapse, the old, ancient question arises again: why? The answers are found in the witch. If your neighbor is suddenly wealthy while you starve, it is not because of global trade, it is because they have eaten your luck through witchcraft. The tragic persistence, modern witch hunts. This is where the story turns truly tragic and contemporary. The fear of witchcraft continues to manifest in severe, violent persecution in parts of Africa today, particularly targeting the most vulnerable. Children. Thousands of children have been branded as witches, particularly in Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Often, they are accused of witchcraft by family members trying to explain illness, disability, or economic misfortune. These children face brutal exorcisms, abandonment, or outright violence. Older women. Just as in 17th century Europe, older, widowed women, those who are economically vulnerable and outside the protection of a nuclear family, are easy targets for accusation when misfortune strikes. This is a stark mirror to history. We see the same pattern repeat. Societies under extreme stress use the ancient, terrifying figure of the witch to explain the unexplainable and to cleanse themselves of the guilt of poverty, disease, and social failure. The difference is that in this contemporary crisis, the fear is amplified by a world of rapid, unsettling change. If the 17th century was the peak of the fear, the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment, was the beginning of the end for the European witch hunt. As philosophers championed reason, logic, and scientific inquiry, the reliance on spectral evidence and torture-induced confessions began to look less like piety and more like cruelty. Doctors started looking for natural causes for disease, lawyers demanded tangible evidence, and judges grew weary of the chaos. The legal and intellectual elite began to view the belief in witches not as a theological necessity, but as a vulgar superstition of the ignorant masses. By the mid-1700s, laws criminalizing witchcraft were being formally repealed across Europe, and the figure of the witch was largely confined to folklore, nursery rhymes, and the occasional theatrical villain. The witch hunt, in its organized form, was over. But the story of the witch was not. The 20th century, the Reclamation. The most astonishing twist in our story occurred in the 20th century. For 300 years, the witch had been a symbol of evil, death, and female malice. But beginning around the 1940s and 1950s, the witch began to be reclaimed. This movement was driven by a deep historical curiosity and a desire to reconnect with pre-Christian spirituality. A key figure was Gerald Gardner, who, alongside others, pioneered a new religious movement known as Wicca. Wicca was inspired by the idea, popularized by figures like anthropologist Margaret Murray, whose theories are now largely discredited by historians, that the persecuted witches of the past were not Satanists, but the last remnants of an ancient, pre-Christian European fertility cult. The modern witch took on an entirely new identity. Nature connection. The modern witch rejects the Abrahamic idea of dominance over nature, instead embracing a deep connection to the earth, the cycles of the seasons, and the divine feminine, the goddess. Personal sovereignty. The modern witch is a symbol of rebellion and autonomy. They reclaim the power that the church and state once demonized, turning the old accusations of secret knowledge into a celebration of self-empowerment. Ethics. Central to modern Neopagan witchcraft is the Wiccan Rede, and "it harm none, do what ye will." This principle ensures that their magical practice focuses on healing, protection, and personal growth, not maleficium. The enduring mirror. Today, the witch is everywhere, in books, films, and the cultural landscape. It has been transformed from an ancient answer to "why me?" into a modern symbol of "who can I be?" But as we conclude this 2-hour journey, we must hold the history in both hands. In one hand, we hold the myth, the symbol of the autonomous woman, the nature worshipper, the powerful healer. In the other hand, we must hold the reality, the tens of thousands of lives lost, the children persecuted, the enduring injustice that continues in parts of the world where poverty and fear still seek a human target. The story of witchcraft is the ultimate human story. It shows us that when we fail to understand misfortune, we invent a human enemy to carry the blame. It reminds us that magic is not just about spells, it is about power, and the deep, terrifying consequences of deciding who in our community is worthy of suspicion, and who is worthy of trust. The witch is history's most enduring mirror, reflecting our deepest anxieties, our greatest cruelties, and our most persistent desire for a world where misfortune has a name, and where that name can be banished. Thank you.